Okay, we'll start with this. WBC President smiles. Canelo will be our franchise champion. World Boxing Council President Mauricio Suleiman has revealed that Mexican superstar Canelo Alvarez will receive a special distinction from his organization. Canelo is a boxer who has crossed all borders, and that is why he will be named as the franchise champion of the World Boxing Council, said Suleiman. Canelo has a tough night ahead when he defends his WBC WBA middleweight titles against IBF champion Daniel Jacobs in a high-stakes unification. The contest takes place on March 4th at the T-Mobile Arena in Las Vegas. Suleiman is very happy with the staging of this particular contest. As BoxingScene.com previously reported, the sanctioning body will stake a special Mayan belt for the upcoming fight. The president of the WBC pointed out that this type of meeting is the exact kind of contest that the fans who love boxing want to watch. I am happy with how everyone can work as a team to make these champion against champion fights because that's what the public wants to see, Suleiman said. There was a moment in time where the WBC and Canelo found themselves at odds, and there was a lot of friction because in 2016 the sanctioning body made attempts to force Canelo to make a mandatory defense against Gennady Golovkin. Instead of doing so, Canelo vacated the title and then more or less blocked off the WBC from being a part of his events. After weeks of discussions, the two sides were able to completely bury the hatchet in 2018, and now the WBC appears to be completely in Canelo's corner. And this further illustrates the unethical practices of the WBC whenever they're dealing with a marquee fighter. You guys got to understand that ever since the WBC tried to do their job initially with the Canelo Alvarez versus Golovkin mandated fight way back when, all they were trying to do was their job. It is their job as a sanctioning body, a governing body that names champions and ranks fighters. It is their job to make sure that certain fights happen in a timely fashion, given the needs and rights, entitlements of both fighters, the champion and the challenger. And all they were really trying to do in 2016 was make sure that a guy who was overdue a title shot for the WBC title, all they were really trying to do was make sure that he got that title shot without any further delays. Now Canelo, the princess, he didn't like that, and that's why he chose to vacate that belt. That's why he chose to cut them out of any fights that involved him. And this was received adversely by the WBC. You see, if they were a more prudent organization, with the best interest of the sport in mind as opposed to their own, what they would have looked at that as is, okay, you don't want to deal with us, when we won't deal with you. You are not above the sport of boxing. You are not above the rules, the bylaws, designations that we mandate based on us being a governing body. But you know what? That's not the case. What the WBC really has in mind is sanctioning fees. Sanctioning fees that they collect from fighters, in which case
they get big ones from Canelo.
They know the value of a Canelo fight. They know what kind of sanctioning fees they can get from a Canelo fight. And with those things in mind, they've chosen to
bend over,
concede to Canelo Alvarez, to play nice with him, to cater to his demands, to cater to what he wants because, well, quite honestly, they stand to gain bigger sanctioning fees from Canelo's fights than most other champions that are out there. So they're willing to bend over for this guy. That's what it sums up to. And you have to wonder just how ethical this is. Not how common it is, because we're all accustomed to it. We all understand it, and we know that it's been going on for a very long time. But what you have to wonder is not how common it is, but how ethical is it for a governing body in a sport to bend over for a participant in a sport like this. In no other sport, other than the sport of boxing, in no other sport do you see governing bodies
bending over like this,
taking these stances for the players in that sport. Not in baseball, not in football, not in basketball. You don't see it. But in boxing, unique to boxing, this is the one sport where you will see a governing body bending over, catering to whatever a player wants, or in this case, a fighter.
Playing nice.
A combatant, a participant, and it's highly unethical, because what does that mean for all the other fighters that are participating? What does that mean for all the fighters that you rank, all the other fighters that you call champions? What does that mean for them when you're giving this guy preferential treatment and special designations that seem to do little more than cater to whatever he wants? Do you do that with everybody, or do you just do that with him? Because you're calling him your quote-unquote franchise champion, and it's all in the name, ladies and gents. Franchise? What do you mean franchise?
Like McDonald's?
Are you guys a governing body in a sport, or are you a business? You understand? What are you guys, like a McDonald's or something? Franchise? What the fuck's that supposed to mean? He's your franchise champion? I'll tell you what that designation really means. All it really means is that when Canelo wants something, they're gonna go above and beyond to get it for him or to cater to him. They don't want to make any more waves, cause any more friction with Canelo Alvarez, because they know they stand to gain the biggest sanctioning fees from his fights, and they want to continue to do that. It's unethical.
It's inappropriate.
But that's the rhyme and the reason. And the WBC is not really hiding this. It seemed a couple of years ago like they were starting to straighten up and be a straight shooter. A little bit more like the IBF. A couple of years ago, it seemed like they were going in that direction. But the WBC is back to their old ways. And at this point, their practices may be obvious to some. They may be obvious to me and you. To a lot of people out there that are familiar with the WBC's business practices, I may be singing to the choir. I may just be repeating myself. But the question that I want to ask today that I haven't asked before is, what is the point of a governing body that fails to govern? That's what the WBC basically are. That in the case of Canelo Alvarez,
There's some others.
what is the point of calling the WBC a governing body in the sport of boxing when, in his case, they're not going to govern him to do shit. They're going to bend over for him whenever he requires them to. What is the need and what is the point of a governing body in a sport that fails to govern, that alters and plays with their rules to accommodate certain guys? What's the point? What is the need for them? What purpose does the WBC serve in the sport of boxing when all you're going to do is rewrite your own rules to cater to this guy?
Among a few others.
Suddenly, it seems like there's really not a need for you, doesn't it? Suddenly, you're not really as prestigious as some would like to believe you are, because all you're going to do is make special designations for whatever fighter makes you the most sanctioning fees.
That ain't governing.
And there's no shortage of governing bodies. There are 4 in the sport of boxing. So the question really becomes, okay, we know what you guys like to do, but the question is, since that's what you guys like to do, what exactly is the need for you in the sport of boxing? What purpose do you serve? You're supposed to be governing these ranks, governing these champions, and making sure that certain rules are adhered to and followed. But it seems in the case of Canelo, you're really not going to do that, because guess what? Jamal Charlo was his mandatory challenger. Now, I'm not opposed to the Daniel Jacobs versus Canelo Alvarez fight at all. I'm very much for that fight. I like that fight. I like that Canelo's having that fight. I like that Daniel Jacobs is having that fight. This is not a complaint, but it is a simple observation that before that fight even got made, before that even came into fruition, if the WBC were really trying to do their job, they would have ordered Jamal Charlo to fight Canelo Alvarez. Instead, they gave Canelo a pass to go up there to 168 pounds and fight for a baby belt with another organization when he already had a mandatory challenger sitting right there at middleweight.
And they knew that.
So if the governing body ain't gonna govern, if they're not gonna do their job, then what exactly do we need them for? That's the question. And I think that this gets lost on some people because they become so accustomed to the practices of the WBC and other organizations like it. They become accustomed to these kinds of practices to the point where they forget that, these organizations, these governing bodies, are actually supposed to be performing a function of the sport. And their function is governing, delegating, making sure that champions act like champions, making sure that contenders act like contenders, and servicing out the entitlements that each are entitled to. But in the case of the WBC, we see that they weren't in any kind of hurry to make that Jamal Charlo versus Canelo Alvarez fight, for example.
They were supposed to.
And yet Jamal Charlo is due a title shot because, well, he's your mandatory challenger. You look a little further up in the heavyweight division and the same kind of thing is going on. Dominic Brazeale was named by them as the mandatory challenger, ahead of Dillian Whyte, who's actually ranked ahead of him. He was ranked ahead of him then, and he's ranked ahead of him today. Yet for some reason, the WBC felt so inclined to name Dominic Brazeale as the mandatory challenger. Okay, fine. But if that's what he is, then why did you try to order a Tyson Fury rematch instead of a mandated title defense? What's the point of having a mandatory challenger when you're not going to mandate him to fight the champion? These designations seem to be little more than decorations the WBC uses to try to cater to the fighters that bring them the biggest sanctioning fees. In which case, you're not performing your function then, are you? Because your function is to make sure that the ranks move along properly and that everybody is receiving their entitlements. And that's not what the WBC is doing. That's why I ask the question, what is the use of a governing body that fails to govern? Now, in regards to the WBC, Whyte aims to become WBC mandatory if Wilder faces Brazeale. Heavyweight contender Dillian Whyte is hoping to become the next mandatory challenger to WBC champion Deontay Wilder. If that fight goes forward, Whyte believes that he should automatically become the mandatory challenger to Wilder. On the other hand, Brazeale is technically the current mandatory challenger. Right now, I don't know, because the Wilder versus Tyson Fury fight fell out of bed. Whyte told Sky Sports. The WBC, they ordered me against Brazeale. Hopefully, they will honor that and keep true to their word, and they will give me the mandatory position. If Wilder wants to fight Brazeale, I should become the WBC automatic mandatory, because Dominic Brazeale is pulling out of the fight, not me. Now, Dillian Whyte's got a point, that if the WBC went as far as issuing out a mandate that Brazeale square off against Dillian Whyte, then why should Dillian Whyte suffer the consequences of that fizzling out when Brazeale is the one that would effectively be pulling out? He's got a point.
He does.
I mean, this is an order from the WBC, you understand. It's not your run-of-the-mill situation to where you got two fighters that want to fight each other and they negotiate the situation amongst themselves. No, this fight between Brazeale and Whyte is also being ordered, or at least it was, by the WBC themselves, in which case, why should Whyte suffer the consequences of that fight not happening when he was actually adhering to the order and Brazeale might not? Shouldn't the result of that fight not happening, it being that that fight went as far as being ordered by the WBC, shouldn't the result of that be that Dominic Brazeale's mandatory status is now forfeit because he didn't go through with the Dillian Whyte fight? I mean, you went as far as ordering the fight, right? So why should Whyte be the one that suffers the consequences of that if the fight don't happen?
He ain't pull out.
He's definitely got a point there. I can see another side to that argument. I can see a side to that argument where they might say that, yeah, the fight didn't happen and you were trying to adhere with the order, but at the end of the day, Brazeale is the mandatory challenger to Wilder's title.
He still is.
And until someone beats him for it, that status will remain unchanged. I can also see that angle of the argument, but Dillian Whyte's got a point, and Dillian Whyte in particular, because he's already been alienated by the WBC. You gotta understand, these guys have numerical rankings, and at the top of those numerical rankings, Dillian Whyte sits at number 1. So the question then becomes, why is the number 1 guy in your rankings not also the mandatory challenger? Then what exactly is the point of your numerical rankings when you're going to go as far as giving the mandatory status to a guy that's ranked behind the number 1 contender? That doesn't make a lot of sense.
It doesn't.
And that goes back to the original question that I posed. If the governing body is not going to govern, if a governing body is not going to do their job, then what exactly is their function? What are they doing? What do we need them for? What does anyone need them for when they're not doing their job? I mean, you yourselves have a set of numerical rankings with fighters ranked within it, and yet your mandates don't seem to be based on those numerical rankings. So the question then becomes, okay, then what's the point of your rankings?
What are they for?
I mean, this really is one of the most essential functions of a governing body, making sure that the ranks are moved along properly so that the appropriate contenders get their title shot, get their entitlements. And yet we see with the WBC that their numerical rankings at times are more of a decorative item or a novelty than an actual means to forecast who's going to get a title shot next. Because Dillian Whyte's been number 1 for some time now, yet he's not the mandatory challenger, and he may not even get the chance to become the mandatory challenger. So if you're Dillian Whyte, you might be sitting there asking yourself, what the fuck do I have to do to get a shot at the WBC title? Should I even be pursuing this title? Now, given the particulars of his situation, well, you did have a title shot with Anthony Joshua, but you didn't like the split, you didn't like the stuff that was going on in the boardroom, so you walked away from that. That is your doing, in which case, the only other title that's available for you to fight for is Wilder's title. So this is, in many ways, a self-imposed wound, something that you're doing to yourself, that you've put yourself in a position to where the only other title that you can fight for is Wilder's title. That makes you subject to the WBC's bullshit. But back to the WBC. What is the point in the WBC? What is
Their function.
the need for them, I should say, when they're not doing their job? I mean, anybody can sit there and put together a nice little trinket and, say that whoever holds this trinket is a champion and charge sanctioning fees for that. Anybody can, get some investors lined up and form an organization of their own. But the whole idea of these organizations, these governing bodies, the whole idea behind them is
Structure.
they give the sport its structure. They make sure that certain things, certain rules are implemented. They are an essential function, or at least they're supposed to be, of the sport's infrastructure. And yet, with some of these alphabets, they really don't contribute to structuring the sport. If anything, they make it more convoluted and confusing. And they downright alienate certain contenders that are attempting to become champions within their organizations. I mean, that's what happened to Dillian Whyte. That's more or less what happened to Jamal Charlo. And it really doesn't stop there. Those are just two of the more recent chapters of this. So you gotta ask, when a sanctioning body is not performing the most essential of functions that they are tasked with performing, then what warrants their need? What are they around for? Because aside from collecting sanctioning fees and making boneheaded decisions, it doesn't seem like they're doing their job. They basically write their own rules and make their own determinations as to whether they're going to follow them or not. And when they're not, they just rewrite their own rules. Which begs the question, are they actually needed in the sport of boxing? I know that can be a bit of a controversial question to ask, especially when it involves an organization which has as much history as the WBC. But you see their practices, you see what they're doing, you see that they're basically just looking out for themselves, and it's a fair question. Does boxing really need these organizations?
What are they for?
That is, if they're not going to do their job, then what is the need for them? Think about it. You've got an organization that is actually willing to acquiesce to a fighter and what his demands are, what his requests are. They're willing to acquiesce to stay in his good graces when essentially they're supposed to be telling him what to do. That is, if he wants to stay a champion with them. And yet, the WBC seems to take a back seat to whatever Canelo wants so long as they can stay in his good graces. In that way, well, you're not doing your job. So if you're not going to do your job, should it even be your job? There's no oversight committee that, oversees all these different alphabets, all these different organizations to make sure that they're operating within ethical parameters. These guys make their own rules, and these guys decide when they want to follow them and when they don't. And in the case of Canelo, the WBC doesn't seem to want to. So, does boxing as a sport need the WBC? That's the question.